It began gently, like a draft you could not really identify. A shiver down your spine without any window open. I had just settled into this lovely vintage Portland, Oregon apartment complex. Brick facade, fire escape zigzag along the rear, full stuff. My apartment, a modest 2-bedroom with sloping ceilings and squeaky flooring, was on the top level. You know, it seems like a location of great historical significance. The first few weeks went really well. I enjoyed the area, the coffee shop across the street, the whole atmosphere. The sounds then began to emanate. It was initially only the odd thud, like someone dropping something heavy. But it was usually late, most people were sleeping by midnight. I discounted it as the ancient building shifting, pipes creaking, that kind of thing. One night I woke up to what sounded like furniture being hauled across the floor, exactly above me. It scraped and bumped for a good 5 minutes. Hoping whomever it was would catch the signal, I even got up, grabbed my broom, and smashed it against the ceiling. The sounds ceased, but I remained awake for hours listening while my heart hammered. I visited Mrs. Henderson, a worn-out-looking lady, the building manager, right away the next morning. "Mrs. Henderson, I have to wonder if someone lives above me. Last night I heard the most unusual sounds." She forced me to grin tiredly. "Honey, you are on the top floor. Ain't nobody up there in years, not since..." She trailed off, her eyes somewhat far off. "Not since what?" "Forced." She gave her head a shake. "Nothing for you to give cause for concern. Simply an ancient construction is all." But I was concerned. I began inquiring of the other renters about their hearing. Most of them simply brushed it off, but one old-timer, Mr. Davis, drew me aside when I brought up the furniture dragging. "You also hear that too, huh?" murmured, his eyes darting around as if he wanted no one else to hear. "You possess feeling a cold slink up my arms?" I asked. He huddled in close proximity. "Happened a few years ago as well. Lady resident of your unit began to hear it. So severe she moved out in the middle of the night." "Did she ever mention what it was?" Mr. Davis just shook his head and went back to his apartment, leaving me standing there with a pit of anxiety building in my gut. The sounds kept on, becoming more frequent and strong. One night, muffled voices rising and falling in enraged tones sounded like a full-fledged dispute above. I even assumed I heard something breaking, a crash. When I phoned the cops, everything was quiet by the time they showed their features, a combination of irritation and anxiety as they investigated the building, even knocked on my door. "Look, ma'am, we cannot locate anybody." You sure you paid attention?" I wanted to scream, "Of course I heard something." I nodded, thinking I was going nuts. Sleeping turned into a far-off recollection. I was on edge all the while, leaping at every building groan and creak. I began visiting the coffee shop across the street, any place except my own apartment, more and more. Then came the evening I will never forget. On this stormy night, wind roaring down the street, and rain lashing at the windows trying to read. I was laying in bed, but the storm was making it difficult to focus. I heard it. Abruptly, a tremendous thud just above me, then the clear sound of footsteps. Strong, purposeful walks back and forth across the floor. Terror grabbed me. Paralyzed, I lay there listening, while the feet kept back and forth. Though it hardly could have been more than a few minutes, it seemed like hours. The footsteps ceased then, quite as abruptly as they had begun. Silence. My heart thumping in my chest, I stayed there for a long while. At last I found it intolerable. I have to find out moving forward. I snatched my phone, dialed and said, "I think someone's in my apartment, above me." I turned off the operator when she began asking questions. "Just get someone here, please." I hung there waiting, gripping my phone like a lifeline. Though it seemed like a lifetime, finally I heard distant sirens becoming louder as they drew nearer. Relief poured over me. Someone would believe me at last. 2 cops showed there, their features dark under the blazing lights. I related to them the footsteps, the sounds, everything. They listened intently, then walked upstairs to have a look at it. I waited below, my tension rising every second. Though it seemed like an hour, they were gone most likely in 5 minutes. Their cheeks were pallid, and their attitudes incomprehensible when they at last returned down. "Ma'am," one of the cops said in a hushed voice, "there's no one up there. Above you, the flat is vacant totally. There is nothing, not even furniture, and no indication of forced access." Pausing, he then said, "Are you sure you're feeling all right?" Though I opened my lips to object and tell them they had to be wrong, the words would not come out. I just stood there, looking at them, the reality enveloping me like a fog. I was on that building by myself, alone with whatever, or whomever, was generating those sounds. Leaving most of my stuff behind, I moved out the next day. Spending even another night in that place made me uncomfortable. I still don't know why I heard what I did today. Was it just my old building acting strangely? Alternatively, was it something else, more sinister, unknown? To be honest, I hardly want to. Story. It was late, that type of late when the shadows spread out long and the air seems heavier somehow. Driving back from a sales seminar in rural Pennsylvania, I had a long, monotonous journey over unbroken countryside and the odd small village. I was yearning a good cup of coffee and a nice bed. My phone was dead. I saw him then, thumb out, seated by the side of the road. He was young, unable to be more than 18, and had a tired expression on his face while carrying a rucksack over one shoulder. Usually I wouldn't welcome hitchhikers, particularly not out here in the middle of nowhere, but something about him made me stop, perhaps the way he seemed so lost. Rolling down the window, I said, "Hey, where you were headed?" "Thanks for stopping, your voice is quiet," he replied. "Heading towards Ohio, if that is your direction." Ohio was headed in the right way, so I advised him to climb in. I knew company wouldn't hurt. He identified himself as Ben, and as the kilometers passed we spoke about nothing specifically. Though quiet, he was courteous. And there was something about his eyes, a kind of melancholy that drew at me. Ben called out the window as we drove. "You know, ahead there is a shortcut. Savage is a good hour on this route by cutting over the forest." I stopped. Having never heard of a shortcut, my intuition advised me to follow the main route, particularly since the sun was about to sink below the horizon. "Consider myself to be decent," I replied. "Don't want to run the danger of losing yourself here." Ben nodded indifferently. "Right yourself. Unfortunately, however, the shortcut really saves real time." For a little more solitude we drove. The only sound was the hum of the motor and the sporadic chirping of crickets from the fields. Ben's eyes were fixed on me, and it began to cause me discomfort. I remarked, hoping to diffuse the atmosphere, "So, what pulls you in this direction?" Ben paused, then responded, "Visiting relatives. Not seen them in some time." He said nothing specifically, and something in his voice made me choose not to probe. A few kilometers later we arrived at a road fork. The main road stayed straight, but just to the right was a little dirt lane hardly seen in the approaching darkness. "Lack Creek Road, 5 miles," fading wooden sign said. Ben remarked, his voice almost a whisper, "That's it. The shortcut is that." I slowed, my foot lingering above the stop. Though I couldn't articulate it, I felt something was strange. Right, it was just a road. "You really are sure about this?" My voice reflecting my discomfort, I asked. Ben nodded, intent on the road ahead. "It's good, verify me." Against better taste I went into Black Creek Road. The pavement gave place to gravel, and the trees closed in above to obscure the little remaining light in the sky. The air got distinctly colder, and a dense calm fell, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Though it must have been more than 20 minutes, we traveled for what seemed like hours. The road was dark and twisting, and I was beginning to second-guess choosing this route. Ben continued, "Almost there," his voice next to my ear. Startled, I leaped. "Don't do that, guy, you spooked me." Ben only laughed gently. We were plunged into darkness when the headlights flickered and disappeared suddenly. I pushed on the brakes, the vehicle sliding to stop. "What the damn," Ben said. Knew I ought to have charged my phone. Though it was still dead, I groped for my phone. "Fantastic. Right now what?" Ben's voice oddly calm as he continued. "Don't worry. I'll go try to locate some assistance." He left the passenger door open and into the night. Shiver racing down my spine, I watched him depart. "Hey," gave him a call thereafter. "Don't overreach yourself." Not a response was given. I waited, listening for his footsteps. But the only sound in the breeze was leaf rustling. Minutes turned by. A few times I honked the horn, but Ben never showed up. I started to become anxious. Though I thought about remaining in the vehicle, the idea of being locked in the dark, alone, was intolerable. I inhaled deeply, opened the driver's side door, and then out into the evening. The quiet, heavy air was nearly deafening in stillness. My voice resounding through the woods, I cried out for Ben, but no response came back. My heart thumping in my chest, I began heading in the direction he had gone. The darkness was total, the trees like quiet sentinels on each side of the road. I stammered over pebbles and roots, my anxiety mounting with each step, and then I noticed it, a low light flashing far away. Relaxation came over me. Ben has to have located a vehicle or a residence. "Ben?" My voice strained as I cried out. "Is that your situation?" Once again the light flickering, and I accelerated. Approaching, I saw the light emanated from a little clearing ahead. My blood turned to ice as I pushed through a tangle of limbs and halted dead in my tracks. Under the one flickering lamp in the middle of the area, stood a wooden table, and on that table were a collection of pictures arranged like a macabre feast. Pictures taken of me. My heart pounded in my chest. I came onto the pictures right away. From my social media, images of me at work, with friends, even one of me standing before my apartment building surfaced. The worst aspect, however, was not that. The worst aspect was the man behind the table, his head down over something I couldn't quite see back to me. He was skinny and tall, hiding his face with a heavy hooded cloak. Sensing my approach, he turned slowly and caught his face on the lantern light. Ben came first. But his eyes were unlike the eyes of the lad I had seen along the road. Their cold and soulless nature lacked any compassion. He grinned slowly and chillingly, sending chills down my spine. "Searching for something?" His voice a ragged whisper, he asked. I staggered back. My words seized in my throat. Though my legs felt like lead, I wanted to run and yell. When Ben stepped closer me, I saw what he was clutching in his hand. The picture was a snapshot. My license of drivers. He raised it, his grin becoming broader. Located it. I was not waiting to find out what he next did. My lungs burning, my heart about to explode from my chest, I turned and sprinted into the thicket. Though I had to get away from that clearing, from him, I had no idea where I was headed. Running till I could run no more. I fell on the side of the road gasping for air. I lay there for a long period, the events of the evening playing in my head like a horror film. I finally flagged down a passing truck driver to get me to the closest town. Though I told the cops everything, they did not believe me. They looked about but never could locate Ben, the clearing, or the pictures. That night, I saw something. I looked into his eyes and saw his grin. And I know I wouldn't be here to relate the story if I hadn't ran. I do not now pick up hitchhikers, and I always keep on the main road. Story 3. There was almost intolerable quiet in the home. The type of stillness that crept in on you, heavy and waiting, broken only by the sporadic tick of the ancient grandfather clock in the corridor. My heart hammering a furious beat against my ribs, I perched on the edge of the sofa, gaze fixed on the baby monitor on the coffee table. We had just settled into an old Victorian mansion in Savannah, Georgia. Its wraparound porch and stained glass windows made it lovely, yet there was a silence about it, an emptiness that made my spine shiver. Mark, my husband, discounted it as old house creaks and settling noises. But I couldn't get rid of the sense that we were not alone. It began gradually a few weeks after we moved here. Humming a lullaby, I would be rocking our 6-month-old daughter Lily to sleep when I heard a tiny murmur nearly drowned out by the baby monitor. I initially assumed it was merely interference, but the murmurs continued, louder and more forceful. I heard it again, very clearly one night while I was putting Lily to bed. Low, guttural man's voice emerging from the baby monitor. "She is beautiful, exactly like her mother." I stopped, blood turning to ice. With palm shaking, I grabbed the monitor. "Hello?" I murmured, my voice wobbly. "Who's there?" I just got a static response. Heart hammering in my chest, I hurried inside Lily's room. Fast. Sleeping in her cradle, her little chest was rising and falling gently. Under the bed, behind the curtains, I investigated the closet. Nothing. Drawn by the expression of horror on my face, Mark walked in. "What's wrong?" His forehead wrinkled with anxiety as he inquired. I mentioned to him the voice, the murmurs, the sense of observation we were under. He listened intently, then drew me into a hug. "Honey, this is an ancient home. Most likely it is just radio interference or something else." I would have liked to believe him. I absolutely did. Deep down, however, I could not get rid of the sense that something was very wrong. I looked up the house's history online the next day. I came onto ancient newspaper stories, property records, even some blurry pictures. Rich businessman Edward Sinclair erected the mansion for his young wife, Clara, in the late 1800s. Their one child was Abigail, a girl. My blood became cold as I dug further into the past. At 6, Abigail had died in the home under unexplained circumstances. Though reports persisted that she had drowned in the bathtub, the cause of death was declared unknown. Several even said she had been killed. Mark looked at the papers as my fingers shook. His face white, he continued. "This is creepy, even for you. Perhaps we ought to give moving some thought." But relocation was not a choice. All of our money had been put into this property recently. Moving once again would not be affordable. Every night the sound on the baby monitor started to repeat itself. It was a whisper sometimes, a growl sometimes, and sometimes a terrible chuckle. It constantly appeared to be nearer, clearer, as if whomever, or whatever, was speaking was directly outside Lily's door. Lily was weeping as I awakened one night. I ran to her room grabbing the baby monitor. I heard it once again as I grabbed for the doorknob, the voice nearer than ever, murmurs across the display. Now hers. I opened the door and waved on the light. Lily was sitting up in her cot, her little finger pointing to the room's corner, and her eyes wide with horror. She groaned, "Mama, man." Hurrying to be by her side, I scooped her into my. With my pulse thumping in my chest, I quickly looked around the room, but nobody was present. Whispering to attempt to soothe her shaking body, "There's no one here, sweetheart. It's fine, Mommy's here." But I shivered coldly down my spine even as I said the words. We were not alone in that place, I realized coldly to the bone. We summoned in an old kind guy with soft eyes and a soothing presence, a priest. He blessed the home, prayed over Lily, and gave us all clear assurance that everything will be well. It appeared to work for a time. The home seemed smaller, somehow. The voice on the baby monitor receded, the whispering stopped. The tranquility did not endure, however. I heard it once again one night when I was in bed, listening to the soft breathing of my daughter in the next room. From my nightstand on the baby monitor, the deep and frightening voice whispers, You cannot permanently conceal her from me. My heart hammering, I sat bolt straight in bed. My hand trembles so severely I could hardly grasp the monitor. Leave her alone. Voice hoarse with panic, I yelled. The hiss of stationery was the sole response. I could no longer stand it. Haunted by the voice, whispering, and dread that something horrible might happen to my kid. I could not live in that home. We left the home, the history, and the terrible voice on the infant monitor behind us the following day. We turned forward only. I can still hear that voice whispering in my dreams, telling me that certain secrets are better kept buried even now. Story 4. The GPS claimed I was headed in the correct direction, but my confidence became less as I drove. Heading from California to Maine to see my sister, I was on a cross-country road trip and had chosen the picturesque route. That meant leaving the interstate for lengthy miles of dusty roads, the kind that cut into the heart of America past abandoned villages and wide-open areas. Driven for hours, the sun sank lower in the sky, casting orange and purple colors on the clouds. Back then, my phone lost service miles. The only indications of life were the occasional hawk swooping above, and the tumbleweeds skittering across the road. After hours of simply barren plains, my navigation app revealed a little hamlet named Jericho, only a few miles ahead. A pleasant sight. I could see a cluster of houses silhouetted against the setting light as I topped a hill. Still, something seemed odd. Like a mirage flickering in the heat, the town appeared. Faded, almost hazy. I shook my head, blaming weariness. Having driven all day, my eyes most likely were fooling me. Driven to stretch my legs and locate a place to eat, I persisted. But the weirder events seemed more bizarre the closer I got. From a distance, the buildings that had seemed strong now seemed run down, with windows boarded down and paint flaking. There was not one human visible among the empty streets. The town was in an uncomfortable quiet, broken only by the sorrowful whistling of the wind. I stopped at a petrol station. The pumps were rusty and covered with weeds. The structure seemed empty, the entrance dangling dangerously at an angle. I paused. A tingle of discomfort slinkers up my spine. "Hi there," I cried out, my voice resonating in the quiet. I got just quiet in response. Stepping out of my vehicle, the quiet enveloped me and accentuated every moan and creak of the ancient edifice. Approaching the petrol station warily, I peered through the filthy glass. The inside was cobwebbed and gloomy, shelves vacant, cash register gone. It seems to have been left behind years ago. I jumped as a sharp blast of wind slammed the door closed deafeningly. My heart thumping in my chest, I whirled around, but there was nothing. Just the deserted street and the quiet buildings staring at me. Growing anxiety crept over me. I ran back to my vehicle. This town, Jericho, seemed like a place time hoped it had forgotten, like a place lost to time. I resolved to carry on driving in search of a town that seemed a bit less odd. But the engine stuttered and died when I turned the key in the ignition. Pumping the gas pedal, I tried once again, but the engine would not catch. Anxiety flooded me. My phone inoperable, I was stuck in a deserted town apparently meant to be used for mockery of my misery. Fast lowering, the sun created long, spooky shadows over the empty streets. Hoping against hope that I would find something apparent, something I could repair, I got out of the vehicle and opened the hood. But I was not mechanical. The mess of cables and hoses meant nothing to me. The temperature dropped as evening fell, and a bone-chilling wind whirled over the town, howling through the boarded-off windows. Breath misting the glass, I hunched in my vehicle, my anxiety rising with every instant that passed. I saw them at that point. Figures, black and blurry, slinking in the periphery of my view. Try to concentrate. I massaged my eyes, but the figures stayed fluttering between the buildings, always just out of reach. I reminded myself that was just my imagination, my anxiety fooling me. Deeply down, however, I wasn't sure. I started to doubt my own sanity in this place, because of something intrinsically unpleasant. Huddled in my automobile, I had a terrible night seeing the figures in the shadows, their words borne on the breeze. I couldn't get rid of the impression that something I couldn't see, something unfit for this planet, was watching, hunting me. Dawn dawned, throwing a faint glow over the abandoned town. And I decided to chance it, and attempt to locate aid on foot. Breath seizing in my throat, I had the bravery to get out of the vehicle and saw them once again. Still there, staring me from the darkness. My pulse thumping in my chest, the figures seemed to be closing in on me, their voices becoming louder, more forceful as I turned and bolted. My lungs burning, my legs crying for pity. I raced till I could no more run and collapsed on the outskirts of town. I turned back. The town had vanished. Disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. All I could see around were blank plains, extending in every way. Later that day, a passing trucker saw me slumped and dehydrated and drunk. He just shook his head and claimed I'd been fortunate to escape the desert heat, even though I told him about the village, the figures, the murmurs. Nobody accepted my account. Their diagnosis was heat stroke, dehydration, tiredness. Still, I remember what I saw. When I arrived in Jericho, I heard murmurs of whatever hides there. And I know certain locations are better kept forgotten. Story 5. The air in the antique store was heavy with the smell of beeswattles and old paper. It was packed with forgotten riches and dusty antiques. I liked looking around sites like these, and picturing the life each piece had touched. I happened into the mirror in a dimly lit spot half hidden behind a tall stack of old luggage. Not like other of the gilded, cherub-loaded mirrors I had seen, it was not very detailed. With a modest, almost austere dark wood frame and a tarnished silver background, this one was straightforward. But its reflection appealed to me in some way. Not initially. Not my reflection I saw. It was a brief sight of yet another location, another period. Gas-lit cobblestone roadway. A horse-drawn carriage rattling across the uneven stones. Then, it vanished just as rapidly, replaced by my own shocked face. I laughed at myself, shook my head. I had to have pictured it. The poor illumination, the musty air, it was all playing tricks on my psyche. Look for anything fascinating. Beside me had come the wizened old man, owner of the business, whose eyes seemed to contain millennia of tales. I remarked, pointing at this mirror. It's ood. He laughed, a rumbling rumble in his chest. They all have antique mirrors, tales, mirror images of life experienced, events caught. He moved a wrinkled hand over the dusty frame. This one, however, she is a little picky. Does not show everyone their actual reflection. I arched an eyebrow, half expecting him to wink and start a well-practiced sales spiel. But he merely stared at me, his eyes steadfast and unnaturally hostile. What is it exactly already? Feeling a weird draw toward the mirror, I heard myself question, a need to discover its secrets. He called a fee, shockingly inexpensive, and I didn't even hesitate. It seemed expected of me, like the mirror had selected. I carried it home to my Boston contemporary, minimalist flat, which seemed oddly incompatible with the antique mirror. Above the fireplace in my living room I hung it. The rich wood stands out against the white walls. It originally seemed to be any other mirror. My meditation came back to me, unaltered, uninteresting. But I began to see something unusual as the days descended into evenings. At first it was faint, a flutter in the periphery, a brief view of something moving in the mirror. Expecting to see someone standing behind me, I would turn my head, but there would be nothing. The visuals then sharpened and become more consistent. In my contemplation, I would catch flashes of individuals I didn't know, clothed in clothing from another age. A young lady in a flowing robe, her face marked with grief. A guy with a handlebar mustache. A group of youngsters engaged in a game I did not know. It was always ephemeral, a glimpse of a universe contained only on the surface of the glass. Still, it was plenty to cause me to doubt my own. sanity. My heart thumping in my chest, I awakened from a restless sleep one evening. The sensation of someone else in the room with me persisted, of being watched. Sitting in bed, I fixed my eyes across the room on the mirror. The room was dark, just the faint glimmer of the city lights peeking through the slats lit it. But in the mirror, I saw a light, a kind, welcoming glow coming from its depths. My bare feet quiet on the wooden floor, I got out of bed and gingerly walked toward the mirror. The light became stronger, and the reflection changed as I neared. I looked no more at my living room. I was investigating another room, a comfortable parlor with soft velvet chairs and a roaring fireplace. Around a table, a gathering of individuals laughed and spoke as their faces glowed softly from the oil lights. They hadn't yet seen me. Their laughing and talk captured them too completely. Enthralled, I stood there observing them, and had an unusual need for belonging. One of them then glanced up, his eyes catching mine across the mirror. He stopped, his grin faded, and his eyes became wide in panic. His tongue moving, he pointed at me, but I couldn't hear the words. The others followed his eye, their features twisted in looks of shock and incredulity. Their voices growing in terrified yells, they rushed back from the mirror, toppling chairs. Heart hammering in my chest, I staggered back from the mirror flickering, the light decreasing, and the image vanished just as quickly as it had shone. Standing in my dark living room, the antique mirror reflected only my own fearful face. I never saw the parlor once again, or the folks who lived there, but I never forgot the sight in their eyes, the fear and incredulity, as if they had witnessed something impossible, something hideous. The next day, I sold the mirror to another antique store 1 mile from my flat. I withheld from the owner the images, the reflections, the anxiety clinging to the glass like a cloak. I wanted it gone just now. Sometimes I still find myself thinking back on the mirror, on the world I saw in its image, the individuals I saw, the lives I observed. And what would they have seen when they looked at me? Story 6. Pine needles and moist ground permeated the air, and the calm was broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot, particularly in the autumn, when the colors changed and the woods were a riot of color. I adored trekking. It was my means of getting away from the city, of clearing my brain, of feeling little and unimportant among the majesty of nature. That day, I was walking a brand new path I had heard about from a friend deep in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. Although the path was steep in sections and difficult, the vistas should have been amazing. After hours of trekking, the sun was already sinking below the tree line, and vast shadows were created throughout the forest. I came to a split in the path and started to consider reversing. There was no signpost or direction of travel indicator. When I got out my map, nothing came of use. Not even indicated was the path I was on. I hadn't seen I had wandered off the trail, I had been so enthralled with the beauty of the trees. Uncertain of which path to choose, I paused. The trees were darkening, the shadows deepening, and I started to feel odd. I should turn back, but something, probably my obstinate pride, made me keep going even though I felt awful about this. Taking the left branch, I reasoned it was as sensible a decision as any. The path constricted, the trees crowding in above to obscure the little remaining light in the sky. The air got distinctly cooler, and a dense hush fell broken only by my own breathing. The route whirled and turned as I strolled for what seemed like hours, dragging me more into the forest. Now the sun had set completely, and the sliver of moon peeped through the trees to provide the sole illumination. I began to become terrified. Every step I went, the trees became darker, more threatening. I was lost, desperately lost. When I reached for my phone, not even a flutter of a bar showed up on the signal. I overheard that at that point. A low, sad wail that appeared to emanate from someplace deep in the woods, borne by the wind. My heart thumping in my chest, I stopped. Though this was unusual, I had heard coyotes before. This was more basic, deeper, more hungry. I accelerated, my anxiety giving my motions quickness. I had to make my way back to the route, back to society, out of these woods. The trees, however, appeared to have different ideas. The track, which had been narrow but accessible, suddenly appeared to vanish completely, sucked into the thicket. Thorny shrubs ripped at my clothing, while fallen branches barred my way. Desperate, my terror growing with every twig crack and every leaf rustling, I persisted. Now the wailing was closer, a chorus of ravenous voices around me. My ankle twisted under me as I staggered and fell. My leg hurt, and I shouted out, the sound lost in the woods. When I attempted to stand, my ankle would not hold my weight. I caught myself, my heart thumping in my chest. I nestled at the foot of a tree with my back against its rough bark. Now all around me was the roaring, so near I could just feel their breath on my face. Tears flooding my cheeks, I closed my eyes and waited for the unavoidable. Still, the assault never materialized. I opened my eyes gradually, warily. The shrieking had ended to be replaced by a terrible quiet. Though the woods remained dark, the anxiety that had been so firmly holding me appeared to have eased and given way to an odd peace. I peered around, my eyes darting among the trees, but I was by myself. Apart from, there was no indication of the coyotes or anything. There, at the foot of a neighboring tree, was a stone heap. Not really any stones, however. Like a little labyrinth, these stones were set in a precise spiral. I gazed at the spiral, my brain trying to understand it. It seemed like a message left for me to discover, deliberate, intentional. I sat there staring at the spiral of stones, not sure how long I stayed. But I felt a weird calm come over me, as the first light of morning passed through the woods. Whatever the spiral was, it seemed to have shielded me from the atrocities of the evening. Following the path the spiral appeared to indicate, I staggered back to the main track. I never heard their terrible howls or saw the coyotes once again. Nobody I knew about the spiral of stones. I knew they wouldn't believe me, hence I probably imagined everything. Nevertheless, I knew what I had seen, and I knew that night in the woods, something old and incomprehensible had been keeping an eye on me. 7th story. Apartment life is unique in that it helps one become acclimated to the routines of other people's life. The man below who blasts opera every Sunday morning. The couple across the hall that fights like clockwork every Tuesday night. Though their names, tales and rituals are unknown to you, their pleasant background hum to your daily life becomes second nature. This is why I became aware when Mrs. Petrov, the old lady living across the hall from me in our peaceful Chicago building, disappeared. She did not like to be gone for very long. Mrs. Petrov lived according to habit. I would hear her heavy front door creak open every morning at exactly 8:00 a.m. Then the slow shuffling of her slippers, as she walked down the corridor, gathering her mail and newspaper. She would come returning every afternoon at 2:00 p.m. precisely, her plastic shopping bags rustling with what I might have imagined were supplies for a single supper. Still, one day the shuffle halted. I initially paid little attention to it. Perhaps she was seeing relatives or unwell. But a knot of anxiety started to build in my gut as the days stretched into a week, then 2. Several times I tried her doorbell but no response. Her unspoiled mail accumulated on the floor. I even knocked on the door of Mr. Cohen, the cranky elderly guy who lived next door to her. But he only mumbled something about nosy neighbors and closed it in my face. Days stretched into weeks, and yet Mrs. Petrov was nowhere to be seen. I phoned Brenda, the harried-looking building manager, who told me she would look at it. Her apartment's quiet seemed strange. It was not just the lack of her normal noises. It was also the emptiness that appeared to radiate from behind closed doors, a vacuum pulling the life out of the hall. I heard it one night attempting to fall asleep, a faint scratching sound coming from Mrs. Petrov's flat. Though it was delicate, almost invisible, it was enough to make me shudder down my spine. My heart thumping in my chest, I laid in bed listening carefully. Like little claws scraping across the wooden floor, the scratching persisted but sporadically. I persuaded myself it was only mice, perhaps squirrels in the walls. Deep down, however, I could not get rid of the sense that something was very wrong. I phoned Brenda once again early the following morning, my voice tense with apprehension. "Brenda? Concerning Mrs. Petrov, it is me once again. Last night, I heard what sounded like clawing from her apartment. Something seems odd in my opinion." Brenda sighed, a long-suffering sigh implying my reaction was excessive. "Look, I'll send someone over to have a look at it. Okay? Still, I truly don't see anything to cause concern." Later that day, a bored-looking maintenance worker with an indifferent toolbox walked up at my door. He jiggled the doorknob, knocked a few times Mrs. Petrov's door, then shrugged. "Door locked here, nobody lives at home, but the scratching noises," I said, my voice increasing in terror. "Last night, coming from within, I heard them." He cast a pitiful glance at me. "Most likely simply pipes, ma'am. You aware of old buildings?" Then he turned and left, leaving me standing there while my anxiety and discomfort mounted with every unresolved issue. That evening, I slept little at all. The scratching noises came again, more forceful this time. My heart thumping in my chest, I laid in bed as my thoughts ran with horrible possibilities. I saw Mrs. Petrov, weak and alone, imprisoned in her apartment, asking for assistance never received. I saw something dark lurking in the shadows, something that had abducted her, and was now attempting to escape by scuttling at the walls. I could no longer stand it. "You have to act." I gave the cops a call. 2 cops showed there, their looks a combination of doubt and contempt. I informed them about Mrs. Petrov, her absence, the scratching noises, and my developing anxiety about something horrible having occurred. They listened intently, then, in relief, decided to look at it. They yelled Mrs. Petrov's name, knocked on the door, then grudgingly forced the latch. The flat lay vacant. Mrs. Petrov vanished. There was no evidence of a fight, nothing seemed wrong. The furniture coated in dust sheets, as if it had not been touched for years. The air was stale. Examining closets, beneath the bed, even behind the shower curtain, the police investigated the residence. But nothing there was. One of the officials, "Ma'am," replied, her voice kind but stern, "I think you might have been mistaken about the sounds. Nobody is around here. This flat seems to have been empty for some considerable length of time." Knowing what I had heard, I wanted to argue, tell them they were mistaken. But their expressions and the way they looked at one another suggested they had already decided. I was only a lonely lady with imagination. The cops departed, and Mrs. Petrov's apartment's disturbing stillness left me alone with my anxiety. I never learned about her whereabouts. She was only gone, vanished without a trace, leaving behind an emptiness in the corridor and a terrifying notion that tormented my dreams. What if the noises I had heard weren't from outside the apartment? Suppose they were arriving from someplace else totally. Story 8. I jumped and spilled my latte when the sharp ringing tore through the subdued buzz of the coffee shop. Looking around, I expected to see someone furiously looking for their phone, but everyone else appeared to be immersed in their computers or talks. Then I realized my luggage was producing the ringing. As my fingers wrapped over my phone, I searched among the mess of receipts, lip balm, and crumpled tissues, my heart beginning to hammer. Though the screen was black, the relentless ringing vibrated across my hand. Pulling it out, I gazed at it as my tummy knitted. The figure seemed strange, a sequence of numbers meaningless to me. My finger hovering above the response button, I paused. Most likely, it was just a telemarketer, or maybe a false number. But I started to become afraid about something about the relentless ringing, and the way it appeared to vibrate through my bones. I inhaled deeply, then responded to the summons. "Hi there." Very quietness. "Hi there," said again, my voice stiff with fear. "Who is this?" Still, the response was just the faint hiss of static and a low, regular pounding sound, like a pulse in my ear. As I was about to hang up, I heard a barely faint murmur of my name. Sarah, Sarah. My blood chilled, knowing that voice. Like it had been in the final few months before she died a year ago. It was my grandmother's voice, thin and whispery. "Grandma?" My voice shook as I whispered, "That is you?" The only response was the louder now, more forceful, rhythmic hammering. Tears welling up in my eyes, I begged Grandma, "If this is you, to say anything." The call went dead. Mind whirling, I fixed my gaze on the phone in my hand. Neither could it have been her. Grandma vanished. I had been at her burial and watched as her casket dropped into the earth. I tried to make sense of it. It had to be a hoax, a nasty joke carried out by someone knowing my grandma. Deep down, however, a seed of uncertainty had been sown, a terrifying prospect not to be discounted. The calls persisted throughout the following few days. Always the same unusual number, always the same pattern, the quiet, the incessant ringing, the faint whisper of my name, the repetitive hammering. I tried blocking the number, but the calls persisted as if whatever was phoning me had discovered a way past my defenses. Changing my number didn't make any difference. The calls trailed me, a continual reminder of the impossibility plaguing my days and evenings. It was unavoidable. The ringing permeated my existence, a gloomy cloud hovering over me that threw shadows over everything I did. I stopped returning calls, but it appeared to exacerbate things. The ringing would keep on relentlessly until I had to totally switch off my phone. Fearful people would think I was insane. I withdrew from friends and relatives and isolated myself. My phone on the nightstand next to me. One night I was lying in bed, and the ringing began once again. I had switched off the volume, but I could still see the screen flickering with the strange number glaring angrily in the darkness. Closing my eyes and burying my head beneath the pillow, I tried to shut out the sound, the horror, the inconceivable reality gradually disintegrating my sanity. That's when I heard it, plain as day. My grandmother's voice softly murmuring over the phone, "Sarah, I am trapped, I need your help." My heart hammering in my chest, I sat bolt straight in bed. Though the room was dark, I could feel something cold and heavy crushing down on me. Once again the phone rang, the screen flashing, the strange number teasing me with its tenacity. I knew sure enough that it was her, frozen to the very bone. She was somehow attempting to contact me from beyond the tomb. With my palms shaking, my thoughts screaming at me to hang up, to flee, to pretend I had never heard anything, I grabbed for the phone. But I couldn't. Grandma was it. She also needed my assistance. I inhaled deeply, then answered the phone. "Grandmother?" I muttered, my voice strained with terror and an odd, disconcerting optimism. Her voice, faint yet clear, made me shudder down my spine. So cold, so alone, faster now, more frantic, like a heart battling to beat. The rapid beating filled my ear. "Where are you?" My voice just a whisper, I asked. Her voice receded, then the hiss of stillness took front stage. "But it's dark, so dark, in nature." Then a deep, guttural sound sent a shock of horror over me. "Grandma, ask?" yelled, terror strong in my voice. The roar became louder, closer, then the connection went dead with a thunderous static buzz. She never got back to me. The fear, the terrible certainty that something terrible had happened, that my grandmother was trapped somewhere, calling out for help that I could not give her, stayed with me. A terrible reminder of the thin veil separating the living from the dead. The calls stopped and the phone remained silent. Story 9. The ancient home loomed over me, its shadow extending like a black secret in the last of the light. I moved uneasily, the weight of my rucksack pressing on my shoulders, and checked the address written on the crumpled piece of paper in my fingers twice. Oakhaven Lane. This was the place. First house-sitting job, an opportunity to make some additional money while my roommate went on a month-long business vacation. Eager to get some quiet and free from the little space of our student flat, I had leaped at the chance. But a shudder of discomfort raced down my spine as I stood there peering up at the intimidating front. The place had a stifling atmosphere, a wary quietness that pricked over my skin. I inhaled deeply, and assured myself it was only an old home, mostly full of drafty windows and squeaky flooring, but nothing to cause concern. I was a logical person who firmly believed in reason and truth, not actual life, but rather the stuff of childhood nightmares, ghosts and goblins. The heavy brass chili on my fingertips, I stumbled with the key, and at last unlocked the front door. A musty scent like old books and lost memories floated out to welcome me as I pulled it open. The little light coming in from the dusty stained glass windows was poor, hanging heavy velvet drapes in the hue of dried blood around the windows. The room was always twilight. Nothing happens when I flip on the light switch. Great, I said under my breath. Just what I need, a power outage. Searching for the breaker box, I sipped through my rucksack for my phone, its bright beam cutting through the shadows. It was hidden in a dark corner of the hall, cobwebs clinging to its metal shell. I couldn't get rid of the sensation that I was being watched as I turned the switches in search of electricity, half expecting to see someone, or something, hiding in the shadows. I kept peering over my shoulder. At last, with a pleasing click, the lights came on to show the dusty grandeur of the ancient mansion. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, its mantel crammed with fading pictures and ancient clocks whose hands stopped at various moments. A half-finished tapestry lay draped over a needlepoint stand, as if the person working on it had only momentarily gone away. A grand piano stood in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. Every item in the home spoke a quiet tale of life lived and lost within these walls. It was a treasure store. I spent the next few hours sorting through my belongings and seeing my temporary residence. Though the refrigerator buzzed with a strange intensity, the kitchen appeared shockingly contemporary. High ceilings, and 4 poster beds covered with thick comforters, made the upper bedrooms roomy. I felt I wasn't alone as I meandered about the home. Just a little change in the atmosphere, a prickling at the back of my neck, a sensation of invisible eyes tracking my every action. It was nothing I could find. That evening, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, as I lay in bed trying to ignore the creaking of the ancient home around me. Alone, secure, and devoid of everything to cause fear, but I felt as I went off to sleep that somebody, somewhere, was listening. Story. The first few days went without incident. I became used to a schedule, visited the surrounding town, caught up on reading, and tried to ignore the mounting dread that appeared to pervade the ancient home. Shivers down my spine as the electricity flicked on and off at random intervals, darkening the home. Objects displaced from their original locations, a book left open on a table, a chair slightly askew, as if someone had been there observing me, adjusting things just enough to let me know I wasn't alone. I attempted to make sense of everything, attributing poor wiring, drafts, my own neglect. Deep down, however, a seed of doubt had been sown, a terrifying possibility that would not be suppressed. One evening while cooking supper in the kitchen, I noticed sounds coming from above. It sounded quiet, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, muted thud. My heart thumping in my chest, I froze, senses on sharp awareness. Though I paid close attention, the sound wasn't repeated. Just the floorboards, I said to myself, my voice quivering just slightly. Still, I felt as if something was off. Breathing deeply, I reached for a big cast iron pan off the counter, its weight comforted in my palm as I gently upped the steps. The corridor was dark. The only illumination came from the weak streetlight glow seeping in through the dusty windows. With my feet echoing strangely in the solitude, I slinked up the corridor, the skillet out front like a shield. Once again, The pounding sound emerged from the chamber at the end of the corridor, louder this time. The door was just slightly open, a sliver of gloom calling me in. Her heart thumping in my chest, I inhaled deeply and pushed the door open. The room stood vacant. The room darkened when the thick velvet drapes closed. The middle of the room was dominated by a four-poster bed, whose rustled blankets suggested someone had just been sleeping there. I looked around the room, my eyes darting over every corner and crevice. But neither nobody nor anything seemed out of place. I spotted it just as I was about to turn and go, trying to persuade myself that I had dreamed the entire event. Tucked in the corner of the room, a little wooden rocking horse was whirling back and forth, its painted eyes apparently tracking me as I walked. Frozen in place, my breath seized in my throat as the rocking horse gradually stopped, its wooden head slanted at an unusual angle, as if it were observing me, waiting. Cold and claustrophobic, a rush of horror swept over me. And I realized with certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I wasn't home, alone. My heart thumping in my chest, I left the room. The picture of the rocking horse burned into my head. My fingers trembling so terribly I could not turn the doorknob, I ran down the stairs. I kept running till the brightness of the streetlight brought me shelter. The ancient home loomed behind me like a terrible apparition. Too afraid to return inside, I stayed curled on the front porch swing all night, the events of the evening playing back in my head like a horror film. I packed and departed early the next morning. I skipped trying to explain what I had seen or heard, and not bothered phoning the homeowners. I just wanted to escape as far from that home as I could. I did not return. I still feel the weight of invisible eyes on me, hear the gentle thud of something heavy being dragged across the floor, and see the painted eyes of the rocking horse tracking every movement. And I know, with a conviction that chills me to the bone, certain homes are better left unaltered, their secrets hidden deep inside their walls, waiting for the gullible person stupid enough to awaken them. Story 11. The ancient library had a certain sort of enchantment, not the glittering fairy tale kind, but rather the sort that settles in your bones, a subdued hum of history and lost tales. Mostly for quiet, I had worked the evening shift at the Ohio Bexley Historical Library. The silence was a luxury I very seldom had as a grad student. Mrs. Hawthorne, the austere librarian with a bun so tight it seemed like it might break walnuts, handed me the lowdown. Locked down exactly at 10 p.m. without exception. Third-floor archives are in preparation for repair, do not disturb them. And pay no attention to the lights whatever you do. The lights? I mirrored, a bit tensely. Mrs. Hawthorne closed her lips, as if she had spoken too much. Old structure with bad electrical. Sometimes they flutter. Just overlook it. I wrote it off as her being a little quirky. Ancient libraries naturally carried ancient tales. I started my shift. The only noises were the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional building groan. I had a stack of research papers to grade, and the musty, silent air was shockingly good for concentration. I decided to break up at midnight. I meandered the rows, followed my fingertips over book spines, their names murmuring stories from long ago. The great spiral staircase in the middle of the library captured me. Built from dark wood, aged, polished, smooth. The landing had a stunning stained glass window. I sensed a small brightness coming from the third floor as I arrived to the second level. It was a gentle, pleasant glow flickering like candles. Interest aroused, I moved toward the velvet rope cordoning off the stairway. Mrs. Hawthorne's words kept coming back to me, "Don't touch the archives on the third floor." But the light was so alluring, like a lighthouse in the night. I reminded myself I would just have a brief look to see everything was okay. Third level was chilly, the air smelled like rotting paper and was covered with dust. Here, at the far end of the hall, the light was brighter. It came from a set of open double doors. I could have sworn to have heard the subdued, furtive whisper of voices. Fear and exhilaration mixed together in my chest as my heart thumped. With my hand extended, I moved in toward the double doors. The archive room shone in bright, golden glory. but it came from none of the bulbs or fittings. Hovering in the middle of the room, spheres of light lit piles of old books and records. Their soft pulsing created dancing shadows on the walls, like little suns. Mesmerized, I stood there, and found my breath stopped in my throat. The air buzzed with vitality, and I had an odd draw toward the lights, a sensation of serenity and wonder I could not articulate. One of the orbs broke apart from the cluster, and floated toward me as I moved forward. It floated in front of me, throbbing softly, and I felt a warmth emanating from it, a consoling presence that seemed to sink into my very essence. The air got frigid and the lights flashed fiercely suddenly. The quiet presence disappeared, then a bone-chilling fear seemed to slink up from the pit of my gut. The sphere in front of me darkened, its brightness becoming sickening yellow, and I felt a raw, primitive surge of wrath aimed at me. Terrified, I staggered backward over my own feet. The ball came flying at me, and I raised my hands naturally to cover my face. The room darkened completely when the lights went off. My heart thumping against my ribs, I rushed back and bumped into bookcases. As if someone were approaching me in the darkness, I could hear the faint rustling of paper and floorboard creaks. Then the fluorescent lights flicked back on, quite as abruptly as they had disappeared. I stood by myself. The orbs vanished, the room silenced but for my own pulse pounding fiercely. I wasn't waiting to see if the lights would have another change of opinion. Fear driving my movements, I raced to get to my feet and sprinted down the stairs. I kept on running till I arrived at the second floor's relative safety. The dim illumination of the emergency exit sign, a lighthouse in the darkness. Huddled behind the circulation counter, I stayed late reading a thick book of local ghost tales, the events of the evening playing back in my head. Mrs. Hawthorne discovered me sleeping at the desk the following morning, the book opened to a page about ghostly lights said to haunt the archives of the library. She merely shook her head and offered me lukewarm coffee. "Told you to ignore the lights," she continued, her voice a combination of laughter and something else, something that sounded uncomfortably like comprehension. "Not even during daylight. I never visited the third level, and I never again questioned the tales spoken behind the walls of the library, because I had witnessed the magic and evil hiding there." Story 12. The rain was falling in torrents, a relentless deluge headed for the whole city, my shoes squelching with every step. I was wet to the bone and ran across the street, hiding in the neon illumination of a 24-hour restaurant. With worn leather seats, a tall chrome counter, and the reassuring scent of coffee and greasy food, it was one of those classic venues. A small number of customers were spread around the cafe, immersed in their own worlds and unaware of the storm roaring outside. I slumped off my drenched coat, slipped into a seat near the window, and let the rain hammer a constant rhythm on the glass. With her order pad at readiness, a server with weary eyes and a name tag reading Doris hobbled over. "Coffee," I murmured, voice strained from the cold. "Perhaps a bit of that apple pie as well?" Doris nodded, as her pen scratched the paper. "Coming right up, Honorable." Her slow, methodical motions, as she poured coffee for a lone trucker crouched over a plate of fries, seemed as if she were traversing molasses. Unlike the chilly, damp world outside, the restaurant seemed friendly and welcoming. The surge of tiredness swept over me, the adrenaline of the day at last fading. For a conference I was in Seattle, a flurry of presentations, networking gatherings, and late-night idea generation sessions. Getting back to my hotel room, sliding under the covers, and forgetting about everything for a few hours was looking great. My eyes strayed about the restaurant as I drank my coffee, soaking in the known sights and noises. I saw her at that point. Her back to me, her black hair tied back in a loose ponytail, she was seated at the counter a few stools away from me. Her shoulders fell slightly, as if she were holding the weight of the world on them. She was wearing a blue dress, the same color as my best sweater. Her head position and the way she held her shivered my spine. It was like gazing in a mirror, a skewed, disturbing version of myself. Telling myself it was only a coincidence, I attempted to get over the sensation. But my interest aroused and a weird sensation of discomfort crept over me, so I couldn't help but take quick looks at her. Her head lowered over the pages of a book, her brow wrinkled in concentration. If I could not read the headline, I did see her lips slightly moving as if she were quietly mouthing the words. For a long while, I observed her, captivated by her familiar yet disturbing presence. Watching a stranger live on my own flesh seemed like seeing a warped reflection of my own every movement. She suddenly raised her head and met mine across the restaurant. My breath hung in my throat. Her eyes were mine, the same hue of hazel, with the same fleckings of gold and green. But her expression was different. Cold, almost predatory. Cold and stifling, a tsunami of horror swept over me. And I knew with conviction that chilled me to the bone, that I was staring at something impossible, something hideous. She grinned, a long cold smile that sent thrills down my spine. Then she turned away, her eyes back to her book as if our eyes had never crossed. Just as quickly as she had glanced up. My heart thumping in my chest, my thoughts racing, I sat there frozen in place. I wanted to escape, scream, do anything but sit there and stare at the unreal mirror of myself. But I was immobile. Fear paralyzing me, I found myself caught in the disturbing scene of the cafe. The rain still tapping on the glass, the smell of greasy food and coffee suddenly choking. I don't know how long I remained there, but finally she closed her book, got up and left the cafe, vanishing into the rain-soaked night without turning around. I never saw her again. But the memory of that night, the horrifying meeting with my own mirror, lingered with me. A disturbing reminder that perhaps the most terrible monsters are the ones we carry within ourselves. Story 13. The sweet cloying perfume of overripe corn permeated the heavy and motionless air, which also smelled of moist ground. Long spooky shadows created by the setting sun stretched out over the field like grabbing fingers toward the gravel road where our automobile had stopped. "Great," my brother Mark said, frustratedly slapping his hands on the driving wheel. "Just fantastic. What now?" Every year, we traveled to see our grandparents in rural Iowa, and our trip always seemed to include some kind of road accident. This year it was the alternator, or so Mark, the technician, he saw himself as. I groaned and raised my sunglasses up my nose. "Relax, actress of drama. Dad will know what to do, we will phone him." Mark looked at me with a scathing glance. "Indeed, we will be here all night waiting for him to travel 2 hours from civilization." He had nothing to be incorrect. Our mobile coverage was patchy at best, and the only indication of life for miles was the vast swath of cornfields running in every direction, their stalks softly waving in the wind like quiet sentinels. Pushing open the automobile door, I responded, "Fine, let's at least try to find a signal." I left into the dirt lane, the gravel crunching beneath my trainers. The humidity clinging to me like a second skin made the air oppressive. A swarm of gnats swarmed angrily about my head, and I could feel the perspiration tickling at my hairline. "Any luck?" from the automobile, Mark contacted. I shook my head, defeatedly holding out my phone. "Nothing, perhaps if I stroll a little down the road." Mark advised not stretching too far. "It's dark not too far off." I turned from him, already along the gravel road. The lowering light formed long twisted shadows in front of me. On each side the tall corn stalks waved lightly in the air. Walking, I heard a faint sound, just perceptible above the soft buzz of insects and the far-off chirping of crickets. Like whispers borne by the breeze, there was a faint, whispering sound emanating from someplace deep inside the cornfield. Stopped. I listened carefully. My heart began to hammer in my chest. The muttering became louder, nearer, and I could have thought I heard my name, spoken in a chorus of subdued, insistent tones. "Sarah, Sarah, come closer." A chill raced down my spine, and I was seized with a primitive terror, the kind that causes your hair to stand on end. Though my feet seemed anchored to the ground, as if some invisible power was keeping me there, I wanted to flee back. The muttering became louder, whirling around me and calling me in depth. The cornstalks felt on my arms, their leaves like chilly, clammy hands on my flesh. A whisper near my ear. "Don't go any further." My heart jumping into my throat, I whirled around, but there was nothing. Just the seemingly limitless fields of corn, their stalks softly moving in the air, their leaves whispering mysteries I would not know. "Sarah, come closer, we won't harm you." Now the voices of everyone around me were whispering, imploring, their tone changing from welcoming to forceful, demanding. Starting to tremble, the earth under my boots sounded deep and rumbling, as if from the center of the cornfield. Terror gave my feet quickness, and I turned and sprinted, my legs screaming for relief, my lungs burning. If I could hear the murmuring voices behind me, becoming louder, angry, as if they were hunting me, their invisible presence nibbling at my heels. I dared not turn around. I kept on running till I came across the vehicle, flung myself into the passenger seat, closed the door behind me. "Drive!" gasped, my voice choked with horror. "Just keep on driving." Mark, whose face was pale with worry, did not require repeated instruction. He launched the vehicle into motion, and we raced away from that cursed cornfield, the whispering voices disappearing into the distance, a sobering reminder of the invisible powers lurking just outside our awareness. Though we never spoke about that night again, I still have dreams about that cornfield, the whispering voices, the sensation of being watched, chased by something old and incomprehensible. I still can't even look at a field of corn without shivering down my spine, a primitive terror whispering in the rear of my mind, "Don't get too near, they're listening, they're waiting." Story 14. As I hunkered on the ski lift, the metal bar pressing into my gloved hands, the howling wind carried snow into a blinding frenzy. The once familiar ski slopes of Aspen, Colorado, were now a whirl of white below me, the lights from the lodge only pinpricks in the approaching gloom. It was meant to be a little run, a last down before they shut the lifts for the evening. But a mistaken detour had brought me to a quiet, unmarked route, and now, stuck on this rickety chairlift, I understood the weight of my error as the storm tore around me. The lift groaned to stop, the wires straying in protest as the wind swung us back and forth like a toddler's toy. Looking at the vacant chair next to me, I yearned urgently for the companionship of another human, even a stranger, to interrupt the terrible loneliness. Panic bit the margins of my calm. Dead in my pocket, my phone was worthless in the cold. Assuming everyone was safely down the mountain, I assumed the ski patrol would have already gone around. Each one of us stretched into an eternity as the minutes passed, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. The snow dropped harder, hiding the earth below in a white, quiet blanket. The wind howled louder, a melancholy symphony ringing over the valleys. I then heard it. Metal against metal, a faint scraping sound emanating from some height above me. My breath fogging in the cold air, I bent my neck and saw it. Another chairlift was swinging dangerously in the wind and headed toward me. But it was devoid. The seat ripped clean off, leaving only jagged edges glinting menacingly in the last light. And its metal structure was twisted at an unusual angle. Cold and suffocating, I felt a tsunami of nausea. The elevator I was caught in was not meant to be moving. Under what force was it tugging upward into the storm's teeth? The empty chairlift came level with mine, and the scratching sound got louder, nearer. For a brief while, I could have claimed I saw a black shape against the whirling snow. A body curled in the shadows of the damaged frame. Then the lift jolted ahead, going on its climb up the mountain, and my stomach lurching into my throat. The empty chairlift disappeared into the storm behind me, sucked under the whirling snow and the approaching gloom. I was being pushed into the core of the storm, higher and further away from the lodge's security. Terror, raw and basic, shot across me. My voice grabbed away by the screaming storm. my cries for aid lost in the great, merciless wilderness. I yelled into the wind. The temperature dropped, the stinging breeze penetrating my layers of clothes, freezing me to the bone. I knew that hypothermia would take hold, and my body would submit to the mountain's frigid embrace if I failed to find a route down shortly. But just what could I do? Trapped, hung between heaven and earth, I was at the mercy of the storm and whatever invisible power was dragging me higher, further from redemption. I made a frantic choice as the last traces of daylight vanished, enveloping me in a terrible twilight world of whirling snow and roaring wind. I was off this elevator now. Breathing deeply, I unbuttoned my ski jacket, the cold wind cutting at my bare flesh. Numb and awkward in their heavy gloves, my fingers fumbled with the zipper of my rucksack, looking for something, anything, that could help. My eyes turned to my ski poles, their metal tips just glistening in the last of the darkness. Not for tearing open metal bars or fighting against invisible forces, they were lightweight, fast and agile designs. But all I had was them. Adrenaline surged as I pushed the tip of one pole into the opening between the chairlift's armrest and safety bar. Though not much, it was a beginning. Leaning all my weight on the pole, I pushed with great force. The metal protested. The bar moved hardly at all. Panic seeped into me, ready to overcome my brittle grip on hope. Suspended in this frozen wilderness, waiting for the storm to grab me, I could not remain here. I had to go back in trying. This time I wedged both poles into the gap, and pushed with every last ounce of might. The metal screeched in protest, and for a horrifying instant, I thought the whole chairlift could collapse beneath the load. The safety bar then groaned in submission, and swung open with a horrible thump. I felt liberated. My little success, however, was fleeting. Under me the earth seemed to be miles away, the whirling snow hiding all feeling of depth or viewpoint. The wind buffeted me, attempting to pull me from her flimsy seat. I knew I lost if I stopped or let fear immobilize me. Another deep breath, and I swung my legs over the chairlift, my heart hammering against my ribs like a drum. The wind stinging my eyes, the chilly metal of the elevator dug into my gloved hands. I merely hung there for a minute, my destiny teetering dangerously between the storm-tossed heavens and the whirlpool below. Then I let go, silently praying, and then suddenly bursting with terrible bravery. The planet collapsed into a whirl of snow, wind and exhilaration. I fell down, the earth accelerating at me. Time appeared to stretch out into an unbounded period of horror and ecstasy. Then I struck the snow with a bone-jarring force that knocked the wind out of me. My body screaming in protest, my mind fighting to catch up with the fact of my survival, I lay there for a minute buried in the chilly embrace of the mountain. The chairlift's grating sound vanished even as the wind howled around me. I was no longer at the mercy of whatever invisible power had kept me hostage. No more being drawn higher. I was alive. The cold soaking through my snow-soaked garments, I gently, agonizingly forced myself up onto my hands and knees. Although every muscle in my body protested, I was alive. Before hypothermia took me in earnest, I had to flee this storm and find cover. With my knees wobbly under me and my only guidance the vague recollection of the lodge lights, little pinpricks in the great, merciless blackness, I staggered blindly through the whirling snow. I fought to my feet. The snowdrifts were merciless, the descent dangerous. I fell several times, my body wounded and damaged, and my hope became smaller with every minute. I spotted it just when I felt I could go no farther, that the cold had soaked into my bones, and the blackness threatened to take me whole. A weak, orange light flashing far away. The lodge here. Driven once again, my legs discovered power I never knew I had. The snow appeared to separate before me, the wind at my behind, as if the mountain itself had chosen to let me pass safely. My body racked with screams of relief and fatigue, I came onto the wooden deck of the lodge and collapsed against the door. The door opened, and I was surrounded with warmth and brightness. Across the roaring wind, a startled voice bursting with doubt and anxiety pierced through. "My God, you are! We considered ourselves to have lost you." Strong arms pulled me into the lodge, into the warmth and protection. My body shook wildly as I fell onto a nearby seat, staring at the raging fire in the hearth, a lighthouse of hope among the storm. I never found out why the ski lift had malfunctioned that evening, or why it had kept climbing into the teeth of the storm. But I knew, sure as cold as I had been, that I had been fortunate to escape with my life, and I promised myself never to undervalue the mountain's strength, or the invisible powers dwelling inside its heart ever again. Story 15th. Before me the Nevada desert opened out, a huge expanse of sun-baked ground and limitless sky. Heat-driven air shimmered, distorting the horizon into a wavering mirage. Pursuing an ambition, and outrunning a shattered heart, I was traveling across country from New York to California. The only sound save the low thrum of the engine, the odd crackle of static from the radio as my beat-up Honda Civic rumbled and hummed over the barren terrain. She was lovingly called the Beast. Miles from any place, the last town fading memory in my rearview mirror showed. I saw something ahead as the sun started its sluggish drop and created long, spooky shadows over the desert plain. Beside the road stood a collection of items silhouetted against the flaming heavens. Drawing closer, I saw it was a roadside shrine, a homemade monument covered with sun-bleached pictures, worn-out crosses, and fading blossoms. Despite the blazing heat, a shiver raced down my spine, and a basic discomfort settled over me. Before, I had seen similar memorials strewn across desolate stretches of road, sober memories of lives gone too quickly. They constantly made me depressed as they reminded me of the fleeting character of life, and the arbitrary direction of destiny. But this one seemed unique. A tangible sensation of grief, and something other, something deeper, emanated from it, and shivered down my spine. My foot hanging over the brake pedal, I slowed the automobile, caught between curiosity and a developing impulse to carry on. Something made me pause. I switched off the engine, stopped by the side of the road, a safe distance from the shrine. Only the soft buzz of the wind blowing through the scrub brush disturbed the eerie quiet. I stepped out of the vehicle, the heat striking me like a physical blow, and warily walked toward the shrine. The aged, worn and broken pictures showed a young couple whose grins were stuck in time, and whose eyes pointed unsettlingly at me. Attached on a wooden crucifix, a handwritten letter said simply, "Forever in our hearts, in peace." Something about their looks, a terrible familiarity, made me shudder down my spine. Though I couldn't put it, I felt a weird connection to these strangers, a shared grief across time and situation. Lost in thought, I stood there as the wind picked up, whirling around me, bringing a faint whisper, a sad sigh that appeared to come from the center of the shrine. Though the heat, I trembled and tightened my jacket about me. The sun sank below the horizon, splashing orange, purple and blood-red colors across the sky. The shadows spread out like grabbing claws toward the shrine, toward me. The muttering became louder, closer, and I could have said I heard my name, whispered in a chorus of subdued, desperate tones. "Turn back, it's not safe." My heart thumping in my chest, I whirled around, but there was nothing. Just the vastness of the desert, the lowering sun, and the shrine, its presence hovering over me like a phantom. Raw and basic terror shot through me. With my legs feeling like lead, I staggered back toward my vehicle, and found my breath caught in my throat. I looked back at the shrine as I struggled with the vehicle keys. My hand trembled so severely I could hardly get the key in the ignition. The pictures showed the young couple's vanished faces. Their place was my own mirror, looking out at me with a hateful look that made my blood stop. A scream seized my throat, a choked cry dead in the silence of the desert night. My heart slammed against my ribs like a terrified prisoner, my blood turned to ice. I wasted time attempting to make sense of the unworkable. I threw the vehicle into drive and hit the speed pedal, dusting the shrine and its terrible message behind in a fog. Desperate to get as far as I could between myself and that cursed location, I drove the beast harder, even though the engine wailed in protest. The headlights sliced across the night, lighting the never-ending asphalt strip in front of me like a lifeline. Shivers ran down my spine with every breeze against the automobile and every chassis creak. I continued looking in the rearview mirror, a brief glance of the shrine, the couple's features, my own distorted image. Still, nothing existed. Just the deserted road, and the huge merciless desert. Driven by adrenaline, and an unresolved fundamental dread, I drove into the night. The kilometers passed, the digital clock on the dashboard noting the passage of time, but the sense of anxiety that had engulfed me at the shrine would not go. I never let myself slow down until the sun started to rise, and the eastern sky started to show pink and gold. My body quivering with tiredness, my head still whirling from the events of the evening, I pulled into a desolate rest stop. My legs wobbly under me, I staggered out of the vehicle and headed to the edge of the parking lot, staring out at the great swath of desert. Though it chased away the shadows of the night, the rising light gave the terrain a warm glow that did not help to soothe the discomfort chewing at my spirit. I knew with a surety that chilled me to the bone, the shrine had been a warning, a forerunner of something sinister and evil lurking just beyond the curtain of my awareness. But what did it mean? Why had my own reflection seen in the pictures? Was it a portent of my own death? A sobering warning that death waited around every corner ready to claim me, as it had done the young couple in the pictures? Alternatively, was it something else, something more ominous, a curse maybe, or a sign I was on the wrong road, approaching a place would be my undoing? I was lacking the responses, but the morning light glinting off the glass as I stepped back into my vehicle made me realize that both literally and symbolically, my path had become more urgent. Not only was I meant to achieve a dream, but also I had to flee a destiny that appeared to be closing in on me, its shadow extending long, icy, like the hand of death itself over the desert. Story 16th. Rising on a hill, the ancient farmhouse was a worn-out sentry against the sea wind's unrelenting assault. It watched the Atlantic. Left to me as her last present, my grandmother had left a spot rich in childhood memories and the sour scent of the Maine shore. That was a fixer-upper, rather clear-cut. The flooring creamed, the paint peeled, and the wind whistled through window frame cracks. Still, it was home. Or at least it might have been. I spent days sorting boxes, chasing cobwebs, and attempting to ignore the general loneliness that hung over the home like a veil. A continual reminder that I was alone. My footfall resonated in the empty rooms and my voice bounced off the naked walls. One evening I strolled out to the backyard as the sun sank below the horizon, casting orange and purple colors across the sky. The smell of salt and pine permeated the air. The sound of the waves breaking against the rocks provided a comforting backdrop to the house's solitude. An old well stood half-hidden by thick ivy and the twisted limbs of an ancient oak tree at the border of the property. Age had worn smooth the stone rim, the wooden bucket long gone replaced with a rusted metal chain that vanished into the blackness below. I looked down into the depths of the well, but the last of the light gave no view of the water below. Though the nighttime air was pleasant, a shudder raced down my spine and a primitive discomfort settled over me. Local residents have whispered tales about the well. Stories of a young lady who had taken her own life deep inside, distraught and pushed to hopelessness. They said her soul still remained, caught in the frigid embrace of the well, her pleas for rescue resounding over the years. I had written off the stories as local mythology, the stuff of campfire legends and hyperactive imaginations. But now standing there, the quiet engulfing me, the air heavy with an invisible presence, I wasn't sure. I threw a little stone I had selected into the well. The darkness buried the sound of its fall. There was no splash of water audible, just a disturbing quiet. I listened as I turned to go. Coming from the bottom of the well, a faint sound hardly discernible over the breaking waves and the rustling foliage. A voice stopped, heart thumping in my chest. I listened carefully. Once again borne on the wind, a gentle sad whisper. "Help me." Though the nighttime air was pleasant, I shivered and tightened my jacket about me. "Hi there." Why, voice quivering slightly, I yelled out. "Is someone down there?" The sole response came from the sad sigh of the breeze over the woods. I reminded myself that was just my imagination. The breeze was fooling my ears. Deep within, however, a seed of uncertainty had been sown, a terrifying prospect unquenchable. Approaching the well, my eyes were pulled to its black, unblinking eye. "Hello?" I cried out once again, my voice more forceful this time. "And you hear me?" "Closest now, clearer," whispered back the voice. "Please, help me." Cold and stifling, a tsunami of panic swept over me. My pulse thumping in my chest, my thoughts screaming at me to go, I staggered back from the well. I couldn't move, however. Rooted to the ground, my eyes fixed on the black depths of the well, as if some invisible power were imprisoning me. The voice became louder, more forceful, its tone moving from begging to demanding. "Help me, or you'll join MME." I wanted to flee, yell, do anything but stand there gazing into the abyss. But my voice vanished, my legs disobeyed, and a weird sensation of inevitability, of surrender, descended over me. The air around me became colder, the smell of salt and pine replaced with a metallic cloying perfume that made my stomach turn over. The shadows from the trees appeared to extend toward me like gripping claws. Then I spotted it, rising gently from the depths of the well, a face pallid and thin with eyes burning with a cold, otherworldly fire. Its long black hair spun about its head like a ghastly halo, twisted with seaweed and something glistening wetly in the last light. The visage opened its lips, a wordless scream wriggling its features, and extended a hand towards me, its long skeleton fingers tipped with the same sticky material clinging to its hair. At last I found my voice, a primitive scream of dread tearing across the calm of the evening air. How I fled is unknown. I just recall sprinting, my lungs burning, my legs pounding. The picture of that face, those eyes burned into my head. Running continued till I arrived at the house's safety. I slammed the door shut behind me, the sound resonating through the vacant rooms like a gunshot. Every creak of the ancient home, every breath of the wind sent chills down my spine as I curled in the living room's corner all night. I packed and headed off the following morning. I never returned to the country home. I could not. The memory of that night, the voice from the well, the face in the darkness, haunted my dreams. A terrible reminder of the invisible forces lurking just beyond the veil of our perception, waiting for the moment when our curiosity, fear, desperation, gives them the power to bridge the gap between their world and ours. Story 17. The ancient television fluttered in the room's corner, its screen hypnotically covered in still snow. Desperate for anything, to relieve the monotony of another Saturday night alone, I sat on the floor with my legs crossed and a bowl of popcorn abandoned on my lap, channel surfing. Having left me in charge of the home and my own devices, my parents were out of town, a rare weekend trip. Usually I embraced the alone, the ability to blast music, consume junk food, and stay up late watching horror movies. But today a peculiar uneasiness had crept over me, a prickling disquiet that seemed to heighten the emptiness of the place. I went past infomercials, reality TV programs, blurry reruns of sitcoms I'd never heard of, clicking across the stations. As if the TV itself were becoming irritated with my quest, the static between stations appeared to become louder, more forceful. I then came onto it by accident. A channel I had never seen before, its screen whirling like a kaleidoscope on fast forward, along with a low, steady buzzing sound that seemed to resonate over the floor and into my bones. The colors pulsed and changed. When I attempted to switch the channel, the remote wouldn't react. The television seemed to have a life of its own, imprisoned me to this fascinating show. Watching, enthralled and more uncomfortable, the colors started to combine to create pictures, forms, flickering in and out of focus. A face pale and thin, with unearthly fire burning in the eyes. A hand, skeleton and gnarled, stretching from the shadows. A person covered in darkness, its shape changing and twisting as if it were trying to escape the screen. The buzzing sound became stronger, vibrating through the room, through me, until it seemed as if my teeth may rattle free. I heard it then as well. Low guttural voice whispering my name. Emily. Emily. Heart beating in my chest, my breath caught in my throat, I sprang back from the TV. The pictures on the screen whirled faster, brighter, as if reacting to my anxiety. They flicked fiercely. From a whisper to a growl, the voice became louder and more forceful. Emily, you cannot hide. We are here for you. Terror, raw and basic, shot across me. I got to my feet and knocked over the popcorn bowl, the grains strewn across the floor like little white bones. Before whatever was on the other side found a path through, I had to cut off the television and sever the link. But my legs felt like lead. My body stopped in place under a terror so strong it went beyond logic. The pictures on the screen sharpened. The colors whirled faster, brighter, till the room glowed eerily, unearthly. The television then blackened with a thunderous crackling of static and a dazzling flash of light. My heart thumping in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The quiet deafening after the cacophony of sound and light that had enveloped the room just seconds before stood there for a time. The home was dark. The only illumination coming from the streetlights pouring in through the drapes created long, spooky shadows over the walls. My fingers shaking, I moved away from the TV and grabbed for the light on the end table. But I sensed it before my fingers could tightly encircle the switch. A chilly blast on the rear of my neck sent a shudder down my spine unrelated to the room's temperature. My heart jumping into my throat, I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the quiet TV, and the residual fear hanging around like a cloak. I reminded myself it was only my imagination, the fallout from too much junk food, and a late-night horror movie binge. Deep down, however, a primitive fear, the type that whispers of invisible forces and creatures that go bump in the night, told me otherwise. With my bare feet quiet on the wooden floor, I rushed up the stairs, my hand trailing down the wall for support. From the living room, running continued till I arrived at the security of my bedroom. I slammed the door shut behind me and fumbled for the latch. My heart thumping in my chest, my ears straying for any sound that would reveal the presence of anything else. I spent the remainder of the night curled beneath the blankets. The only sounds disturbing the stillness were the sporadic creak of the ancient home settling around me and my own rapid pulse pounding. I let myself fully relax when the first rays of dawn peeped through the curtains and created long, thin fingers of light across the room. The events of the evening before seemed to me like a horrible dream, a product of my too busy imagination. I told myself it was only the television, a broken wire, a power surge, anything except the terrible possibility I had come onto something other, something else that existed beyond the scope of my knowledge. But later that morning, as I made my way downstairs, the recollection of the whirling colors, the whispering voice, the icy breath on my neck shivered down my spine. For the rest of the day, I stayed out of the living room, staring tensely on the blank television screen as if I expected it to flutter back to life at any minute, the colors whirling, the voice whispering my name. I told my parents about the weird channel, the disturbing pictures, the voice that had murmured my name when they came back the next day. They looked at each other amusedly, blaming my vivid imagination and the dangers of too much television. I wanted to start believing them. Indeed I did. Deep down, however, I felt that I had seen something genuine that night, something sinister and frightening lurking just beyond the stillness. poised for release. And I knew with a surety that chilled me to the bone, I would never see a television the same way again. Story 18. The flea market hummed with the typical anarchy, sellers pushing their goods, negotiating rates, the air heavy with the scent of old books and fried bread. I delighted in perusing these repositories of relics, picturing the people they had touched and the tales they carried. I came onto the typewriter this way. Its once gleaming chrome tarnished with age, the keys worn smooth from many words written, sitting on a table heaped with dusty relics. It was a Remington, the dealer had informed me. His voice was austere but not nasty, a typical 1940s type. I attracted to it, strangely so. I didn't even possess a computer, but something about the typewriter spoke to me, its keys whispering tales of past hopes and unwritten stories. I was not a collector. With a smile and a rough "you got a deal, kid," the seller essentially handed it away, a $20 cash. Returning to my little San Francisco apartment, I cleaned the typewriter, its metal frame cold under my hands. At an antique store downtown, I discovered a new ribbon. The smell of ink and dust made me strangely yearnous for a period I would never have known. Unable to fight its appeal that evening, I got down and started typing. Under my fingertips the keys clicked in time, a pleasing contrast to the city sounds streaming through the window. Just let my ideas pour onto the paper, a stream of consciousness about the day, the city, the odd draw I had towards this antique machine. I was not sure what I wanted to write. Strange occurred as I wrote. Typing the same letters again and over, the keys started to stick and create words I hadn't meant to produce. First I assumed it was just the machine's age, the mechanisms gummed with time and usage. The words then began to create logical phrases, nevertheless. Sentences not my own. Beware. The typewriter cluttered, the sound resonating in my apartment's quiet. My fingers lingering over the keys, I paused typing and felt my heart begin to hammer in my chest. Be wary of the one who views. Though the summer night was warm, a chill raced down my spine, a sharp sting of anxiety. Trying to make sense of it, I told myself it was just a fabrication of my imagination, a trick of the light. Deep down, however, a fundamental fear, that which speaks of invisible forces and creatures that go bump in the night, tells me differently. I attempted to stop, shut the typewriter, store it, and forget about the entire uncomfortable encounter. Still, my fingers typed as if they were under the direction of an invisible hand. He knows your secrets, he is near, he is watching. The words emerged on the sheet, sharp and black against the white paper, a physical expression of the mounting horror coiling in my belly. I wanted to flee, yell, do anything but sit there, gazing at the words that seemed to sear themselves into my skull. But I stayed still. As if fascinated by the typewriter's repetitive clatter and frightening message, I was held in place and fixed on it. He is here for you. The last words lingered in the air, a quiet scream reverberating within my little flat. My heart thumping against my ribs like a furious bird, I turned away from the typewriter. Usually a soothing buzz of metropolitan activity, the city sounds outside suddenly appeared exaggerated, twisted, tinged with a menacing undertone. I looked around the room, my eyes flitting from shadow to shade in search of any movement, any clue that I was not alone. But nothing at all. Just the usual clutter of my flat, the street lights pouring long, thin fingers of light over the walls, and the typewriter, silently now, its letter delivered on the table. That evening I did not fall asleep. Shivers down my spine from every creak of the ancient structure and from every sigh of the wind on the window pane. My eyes wide open, my senses sharpened, I lay in bed listening for any sound that may reveal the presence of the watcher, the one who knew my secrets. The dawn chased away the shadows of the night through the window the following morning, and with it part of the anxiety that had so firmly seized me. I told myself it was all a dream, a nightmare brought on by tension and the unpleasant atmosphere of the ancient typewriter. Still, I couldn't get rid of the sense that something had changed, that I was no more alone. For days I avoided the typewriter. Its existence in my flat was a continual disturbing reminder of the terrible message it had produced. But I couldn't convince myself to toss it. I felt pulled to it, driven to face the anxiety it had stirred in me. Unable to fight its draw anymore one evening, I returned to sit at the typewriter. Hesitantly, terrified of what would happen and what words might show up on the paper. My fingers floated over the keys. I took a long breath and started typing. I wrote, "Who are you?" and the words rang in the quiet of my flat. For a minute the typewriter stayed quiet, the only sound the soft buzz of the city outside my window produced. The keys started to move then, slowly, carefully. "You know who I am." The words showed up on the page, harsh and black against the white paper, a terrifying validation of my most intense anxiety. My pulse thumping against my ribs like a drum, I gazed at the phrase, my head whirling. "How?" I wrote, fingers shaking just a little. "How do you know my secrets?" The typewriter answered right away, its keys clicking with a terrible tempo. "I hear your ideas, while you believe you are alone." Story 19. This was the old Calico train station in Calico, California. Abandoned for decades, they say. More like forgotten. The chill crept into my bones deeper than any winter wind ever could. It was empty. Like the air itself had been sucked out and replaced with something hollow. Me, the skeptic, always the logical one, Marco, my cousin, was always fascinated by the stories. Phantom trains whistling through the night, spectral passengers waiting on the platform, their faces blurred and indistinct. Me? Not really. The station stood silhouetted against this dying light, a skeletal frame of wood and iron, its windows like empty sockets staring out at us. The silence oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the gravel. We arrived just as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. "Creepy, huh?" Marco said, his voice tight with a combination of terror and exhilaration. "Just an old structure, Marco. Nothing to be terrified of." I tried to sound casual, but even as I spoke the words, a chill raced down my spine. The air grew colder, as darkness deepened. We set up our equipment, a couple of handheld cameras, a voice recorder, and a flashlight. We walked across the main waiting area, our flashlight beam dancing over the peeling paint and dust-covered benches. The silence was heavy, pregnant with something. "Did you hear that?" Marco abruptly seized my arm with a hard grasp. I strained my ears, but heard only the wind blowing through the shattered windows. His eyes wide, he said, "A whistle, like a train whistle." "Just the wind, Marco." I shook my head. The temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air. We returned inside, more nervous than ever. We sat on one of the seats, the camera rolling, the recorder recording the quiet. Suddenly, a chilly blast of wind rushed over the waiting room, even though the windows were closed. With a slightly quivering voice, "Okay," I said, "this is getting a little weird." But the footfall persisted, slow, methodical, approaching. We could sense something cold, invisible, out there. "Hello?" I said, my voice just a whisper. Not a response, just the footsteps. Abruptly a figure formed at the edge of the platform. A lady in a long black coat, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, stood immobile, peering out at the empty tracks. "Hello," I said once again, this time with a somewhat louder voice. The figure remained motionless and unmoving, then disappeared as quickly as it had been. Gone. Just like that. We stood there for a while, our hearts hammering, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We both understood what we had seen, or what we believed we had seen. We neither needed to say. Story 20. We parked the vehicle at the edge of the woodland, the only sound the soft hum of the engine as we switched off. The stillness that followed was terrible. We took our flashlights and walked out into the night. A moonless night, the type of blackness that takes you whole. "Ready?" Sarah said, her voice a bit unsteady. Though inside my stomach was churning, I attempted to appear brave, born ready. We walked further into the forest, our flashlights cutting through the darkness to expose twisted branches and gnarled roots that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick and heavy, the scent of pine needles and damp earth mixing with something else, almost like blood. Whispering while holding my arm, Sarah said, "Did you hear that?" I listened carefully. A slight rustling sound like something moving through the underbrush. "Probably just an animal," I whispered, trying to comfort myself as much as her. But the rustling persisted, moving closer. It sounded bigger than an animal. And then we heard it. A low guttural low growl resonating throughout the forest, not animal. It sounded human. Our hearts thumping in our chests, we halted, the growling stopped, the quiet returned, darker and more repressive than before. We turned and began to escape, our headlights bouncing crazily and creating hideous shadows dancing and writhed about us. Sarah cried, dragging me into a little lane. "This way!" The roaring resumed, nearer this time, directly behind us. We fled blindly, branches whirling at our faces, thorns ripping at our garments. We could feel its breath on our necks. Our flashlights rolled away into the darkness, and we staggered and collapsed into total blackness. The only sound our rapid breathing and hammering of our hearts could provide. I said, reaching out for her hand, "Sarah?" She murmured back, "Here," her voice shaking. Blindly, urgently, we rose to our feet and began to sprint once again. We knew only that we had to flee. We had no direction. The moon, buried behind the clouds for much of the night, suddenly appeared, bathing the clearing in a spooky, otherworldly glow. And that's when we spotted it. We abruptly broke out from the woods onto a little clearing. A tall and skinny creature stood in the middle of the clearing. Its skin was pale and transparent. Its eyes shone with an unusual brightness. It merely watched us. Fear paralyzing us, we stayed still. The creature lifted its hand and pointed a long, bony finger at us. A deep, guttural voice rang over the clearing, "Leave." We turned and fled, not pausing until we arrived at the vehicle. We hopped inside, shut the doors and drove out, leaving the Black Ridge Forest and its terrible occupant behind. We did not need to be warned again. The Black Ridge Forest holds its secrets close, and I, for one, am happy to leave them undisturbed. We never returned or spoke about it again, but the memory of that night, the growling, the chilling voice, and the brilliant eyes of the figure in the clearing haunts my dreams. Story 21. This was her seance room, dimly lit, filled with incense and candles, dominated by a big round table polished to a high sheen. My grandmother, bless her soul, always believed in the other side. She had a small room in her house, a room she called her sanctuary. I always thought it was a bit eccentric, but I loved her. I never truly believed, not until that evening. One night, feeling very homesick, I decided to attempt a seance myself. I gathered a couple friends, Lisa and David, who were, shall we say, open-minded. After she departed, I acquired her property, including the sanctuary. I kept it unaltered. We joined hands, shutting our eyes. And I tried to recall the things my grandmother used to say as we sat around the table, the only light coming from a single flickering candle in the middle. The air dense with expectation. A weird combination of excitement and fear. My voice quivering slightly. "We call upon any spirits present," I continued. "If there is anyone here, kindly sign for us." Lisa screamed. David's grasp on my hand tightened. Quiet. A heavy waiting quiet. Then the candle flashed fiercely, leaving dancing shadows. On the walls. A chilly gust came over the room, even though the windows were closed. "Is anyone there?" I said, rather more forcefully this time. We gazed at one another, our eyes wide with a combination of terror and curiosity as a faint tapping sound came from the table. "Could you tap one more?" I requested. 2 taps that are clear and distinct. The taps answered, 1 for yes, 2 for no. It was unnatural. The air became cooler, the candle flames swirled wildly, and the tapping grew more forceful. We began asking basic yes or no questions, with a voice almost audible. "Are you my grandmother?" I questioned. "One call." Tears welled up in my eyes. I could not believe it. It had to be her. She told us things only she could have known, things that sent chills down our spines. She told us about the hereafter, about the tranquility and the light. And then she told us something that froze us to the bone. The taps spelled words in brief sentences. She informed us of an angry black presence that had been in the home for some time. Suddenly the candle went out, darkening the room. A blood-curdling scream rang through the house, something other rather than human. Desperate to leave the room, we raced to our feet and stumbled over one another in the darkness. Our hands shook uncontrollably as we struggled for the door. At last we found it and slammed the door behind us. Story 22. The iron gates crested open as I pushed them, the sound resonating across the stillness. I walked inside, the air immediately colder, heavier. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched and distorted, transforming the already terrible convent into something really sinister. The quiet was stifling, broken only by the odd creak of the floors under my boots. The main hall was large and cavernous. The walls coated with peeling paint and faded religious symbols danced in the fading light, producing a disturbing appearance of movement. Once a place of devotion, the chapel now stood desecrated, the altar turned over, the stained glass windows smashed. A sensation of discomfort fell over me, a feeling of being watched, of being not alone. I wandered the convent, room by room, each one emptier and more forlorn than the previous. My pulse thumping in my chest, I halted as I walked into what I thought to be the dorm. From the end of the corridor, I heard a low, sad humming sound. The humming became louder along with the gentle rustling of cloth. With my flashlight beam cutting across the darkness, I strolled gently down the corridor. Then I spotted her. Bathed in the faint moonlight flowing through a broken window, a lady in a long black habit stood at the end of the corridor singing slowly, her face hidden by a veil. Her voice a terrible mix of grief and something more, something evil. The nun turned slowly, her covered face now facing me. I could not see her eyes, but I could feel her icy, sharp glare searing into me. I remained motionless, unable to move, unable to breathe. She lifted her hand, a long, pale finger pointing straight at me. The humming stopped, the quiet that followed was deafening. Then she spoke. She murmured, "Leave," a low whisper, scratchy and eerie voice as if it hadn't been used in ages. "This is not your place." I turned and fled, not pausing until I was outside the convent gates, the cold night air burning my lungs. I didn't look back, I didn't dare, I didn't need to be warned again. Story 23. My morbid curiosity as always led me there. Just the name, Mercy General Hospital in Pennsylvania, sent shivers down my spine. It had been closed for decades, left to rot and decay, a festering wound on the landscape. They said it was haunted, plagued by the spirits of patients who had died within its walls. Said the old medical equipment, still left scattered throughout the building, would activate on its own, whirring and clicking in the dead of night. The silence was terrible, broken only by the distant drip, drip, drip of water echoing across the empty corridors. We slipped inside through a broken window on the ground floor, the shattered glass crunching beneath our boots. The air inside was heavy and stifling, thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something else. Something metallic, almost like blood. Gurneys lay rustling in the hallways, wheelchairs sat abandoned in corners, and IV stands stood like silent sentinels, their empty bags softly swinging in the breeze. Our flashlights cut across the darkness, revealing peeling paint, cracked tiles, and discarded medical equipment. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. The operating room, with its rusted surgical tools and stained operating table, was especially disturbing. I could almost smell the antiseptic, hear the frantic beeping of monitors, and feel the palpable tension of life and death hanging in the air. Each room more upsetting than the next. We exchanged a frightened gaze and gently walked toward the room, our flashlights pointed on the door. We pulled the door open, and the whirring sound became louder. Suddenly we heard it from one of the rooms down the corridor. Inside an ancient respirator, its tubes and cables twisted and dusty, buzzing to life. The pressure gauge fluctuated wildly, and the bellows swelled and contracted as if breathing for a phantom patient. We stood there, enthralled by the sight, our hearts thumping in our chests. A figure covered in darkness stood in the corner, tall and thin, its shape vague. But we could sense its presence, cold and evil. The murmuring got louder, a terrible cry full of anguish and hatred. We turned and fled, staggered over each other in our eagerness to go, not waiting to see what it was. We kept running until we were outside the hospital, the cool night air, wonderful respite from the stifling environment inside. Story 24. I'd heard the stories, dismissed them as local folklore. The kind of thing small towns cling to, not for its scenic beauty, though it has that in spades, but for something far more unsettling. She is known as the Phantom Hitchhiker, a young woman in a white dress seen thumbing a ride late at night, only to vanish from the backseat miles down the road. I stopped, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. She walked up to the vehicle, her face hidden in the darkness. I rolled down the window, a blast of chilly night air enveloping me. "Need a ride?" I said, a bit hoarse from neglect. She nodded, a little, almost undetectable motion. She unlocked the passenger door and slipped into the seat next to me. The inside of the vehicle was instantly cooler, the air dense with an unusual sweet aroma, like jasmine. She said, "Thanks," her voice gentle and sweet. "I've been walking for a while, trying to break the unusual atmosphere that had enveloped the automobile." I inquired. "Where are you headed?" In an attempt at small conversation. "Flagstaff," she said, her voice almost audible. "Flagstaff's still 3 hours away." I shrugged and said, "Hop in. I'm headed that way too." Her face remained hidden by shadows, but I could see the delicate and lovely form of her profile. We rode silently for some time, the only sound the hum of the motor and the occasional sigh of the wind. I snuck looks at her, trying to figure out her features in the darkness. She answered in monosyllables, her voice soft and distant, as if she were speaking from a great distance. The air in the car grew colder, the sweet scent of jasmine becoming overpowering. I started to feel uneasy. I tried to strike her and my pulse beat in my chest. I grabbed the steering wheel harder, my knuckles becoming white. After about an hour, I looked over at her again, and that's when I spotted it. Her dress was soiled, dark, nearly black spots covering the hem, moving upward like blood. The lovely aroma of jasmine was suddenly oppressive, stifling. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, as I attempted to concentrate on the road, and tell myself I was dreaming things. The stains were there, becoming deeper. Her face, no longer hidden by shadows, was pale and thin, her eyes empty and dark, looking straight ahead. Her lips were pushed back in a hideous grin, exposing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. I looked back at her once again. I turned to her, my voice shaking as I slammed on the brakes and the vehicle squealing to stop. Who are you?" She moved her head slowly, her dark eyes locked on mine. Her grin grew, showing more of her teeth. And then she disappeared, gone just as slowly. Story 25. My friend Carlos and I, urban explorers with a taste for the unknown, decided to see for ourselves the abandoned subway tunnels beneath New York City, said to be a labyrinth of darkness, silence and forgotten history. They say the spirits of those who died in the tunnels still linger, caught between worlds. Equipped with flashlights, cameras, and a fair dosage of anxiety, we descended into the darkness. The air was thick and heavy, the stench of mildew and rust clinging to the walls like a shroud. The quiet was deafening, broken only by the drip drop of water reverberating over the tunnels. Graffiti covered the walls, a tribute to the lost souls who had once sought solace in this underground world. The air grew colder as we descended, a chill that seeped into our bones, deeper than any winter wind. Our flashlights cut across the darkness, exposing crumbling platforms, rusted tracks, and thrown trash. The quiet was broken only by our own footsteps echoing in the darkness, and the odd scuttling sound of rats scurrying through the trash. We went for what seemed like miles, the tunnels twisting and turning, leading us further into the heart of the abandoned city. Carlos stopped suddenly and said, "Did you hear that?" His voice tight with a combination of terror and exhilaration. I strained my ears and listened closely. A low, repetitive humming sound, deep and harmonic, vibrated through the very tunnel walls. It got louder, followed by a rhythmic clicking sound, like metal against metal. Whispering back, my pulse thumping in my chest. "What is that?" Our headlamps bounced frantically in the darkness. The humming became louder, the clicking more forceful, and suddenly we saw it. We followed the sound. Sitting on the tracks was an ancient subway car with dark, vacant windows and peeling paint. The buzzing and clicking emanated from under the vehicle, as if the engine were attempting to start. We walked carefully, our spotlights pointed on the car, our hearts hammering, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We remained there for a time until slowly the doors of the subway car started to swing open. The humming stopped, the clicking stopped. The quiet returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. We glanced inside, our torches lighting the empty inside of the vehicle. The seats were shredded and broken, the floor covered with trash. But there was something more. Something pleasant, almost like flowers. A blast of chilly air carried with it the scent of decay and something else. It was tall and thin, its shape vague, but we could sense its presence, chilly and sorrowful. It stayed there, gazing straight ahead, as if waiting for a train that would never arrive. A person covered in darkness sat in one of the chairs, not pausing till we were back on the surface, the fresh night air a welcome respite from the stifling environment of the tunnels. We turned and raced without waiting to see what she would do.